Hello, welcome. So in today's video, we'll be creating a ChatGPT clone using HTMX, Bun, and Pico. So first of all, what is Bun? Bun is a very fast JavaScript all-in-one toolkit. And if you have not installed Bun yet, you can go ahead and install by using this command. So you can make sure if you have Bun installed. So to make sure if you have Bun installed, you can say bun-v, and I have Bun 1.0.1 version installed. So 1.0.2 is already released, so we can go and update. So today we will be building a ChatGPT clone. So here we'll be using our ChatGPT API key, we'll be using MongoDB to maintain our history, and we'll be using our HTMX. So HTMX is a high power tool for HTML, and then we'll be using Pico, which is a minimal CSS framework for our semantic HTML, and then we'll be using our MongoDB to store or to manage our history. So let's go to the application which we'll be going to build. The application which we are going to build here is basically we'll be having this sidebar here where we'll maintain our history, and then we will have our conversation. So this is our conversation section, and we have this text area here, and then we have a button. So when I click on new chat, so basically this will be a new chat. So let me say, welcome to my website. And if I send, so basically this will go to our ChatGPT using the API key. And then we can see we have our response from the ChatGPT, and we can see thank you for visiting the website here. I'm providing valuable information, resource, and engaging, and so on. And you can see as soon as we have this conversation, we can see this in the history here, right? So if I want to go to this Taj Mahal construction, so there were a couple of questions which I asked, like when was the Taj Mahal built? And then this was a response from the ChatGPT. And then I wrote amazing, and then this was the response from the ChatGPT. And whenever I go to this new chat, all the chat history will be cleared for the particular. So this will be initiating a new chat, and then this will be the existing chat with previous conversations. So we can also go and check our database. So is there any way I can refresh this? So let me refresh. So our chat history in our database in Mongo will be inside this chat history collection. So here we can see summary, and then we can see the ID, and then we can see a message. Basically a message is a conversation, and we can have multiple entry. So here we have this role user, which means that this was asked by the user. And then we have this assistant, which was suggested by the ChatGPT. So far, if you can see, we have here the nav item, which is basically the header part. Here we can see ChatGPT clone using HTMX and Bun, and we have this YouTube here. And then we have few buttons here, and then we have this conversation area. We have text input, and then we have our send button. Okay, so this is the project which we'll be building in this section. So let's get started by using Bun, HTMX, Pico, and our MongoDB. Okay, so let me close this, and then let me go to the terminal, and let me create a new folder here. Let me say mkdir, and then I can say Bun GPT Clone. Okay, and then let me go to the Bun GPT Clone. So I hope this is visible. So let's initialize our Bun. So before initializing Bun, please make sure you have Bun installed. So to verify if we have Bun installed, you can say bun-v. So we get version 1.0.1. So this may change as we progress. And then if we want to initialize our Bun project, we can say bun init and press enter. So the package name will be Bun GPT Clone. It's okay with that. Since we are building a front-end application, we can say index.tsx. Okay, and then since we can see we have our packages installed, so let me open this in my VS Code. So I can say code dot. So basically I've opened my code, and you can see when we initialize our Bun, we have all these couple of files. So this tsconfig basically means for our TypeScript configuration, and then we have this readme for our documentation purpose. And it's mentioned here what exactly we should run. If we want to install the dependencies, we can say bun install, or if we want to run the entry point file, then you can say bun run init.tx. And we have this package.json. Here we have dev dependency, which is bun types, and then we have index.tsx, which is empty as of now. Okay, so before we continue, let me add a script section here. So that should look like scripts, and then I want to add a dev script. So when I run dev, so I can say bun run --hot index.tsx. Okay, so I think --hot should be the first argument. Okay, so this way, why did I add this dev command? Because now using our terminal, So in a terminal, now I can simply say yon run dev. You can see we have hello via bun, right? And then since I have added this hot reload, basically whenever I make some changes to this index.tsx or the other files, then our server will hot reload. Okay. So firstly, let's start with our front-end part. So let's add our index.html. So to get started pretty quickly, I can add, let me say HTML5, and then here I can write a document title, and here I can say bun chat GPT. Okay. And then before I continue, let me add few dependencies which we have, like HTMX, and then we have Pico. So let me add this in our script tag. So for this, let me copy and paste, which will be pretty fast. Let me go and paste just below our meta. Okay. So here I've added multiple scripts. So this is basically our HTMX, and I have this hyperscript, which is required by our HTMX. And then I also added this HTMX JSON encoding. So I think we don't really need this. So let me just remove it. And also I've added our Pico, which is our style sheet for our this project. Okay. And then inside this body, let me add a few UI. If you remember in our previous section, we have our nav, we have our sidebar, and then we have our chat box, right? So let me quickly go and add all those required structure. So I can start with nav. Then let me say nav. So inside this nav, let me have an UL. Okay. So inside this UL, let me have an li. And inside this li, let me have a anchor tag. Okay. So it will be basically a. So basically I will have multiple ULs inside this nav. So let me add another UL here. And here, let me have another li. Inside this li, let me add a strong tag because I want to make it bold. And let's say Chat GPT Clone using HTMX and bun. Okay. And then inside this anchor tag, let me add the link to my YouTube. So I can say YouTube, and let me basically copy my link and let me edit in this anchor tag. Okay. So let me close this terminal for now because we don't really need it. So far, I have added my nav. So let me continue with this one. So after adding this nav, I can have my main view. I can say main. So inside this main, I need to have a grid, right? So I have two sections. One is basically the history part, and the other one was the conversation part or the chat part, right? So let me have a div. So inside this div, I can have multiple sections, right? So basically, I can use a side, which will basically means the sidebar, a side. And then let me have another section. Okay, so let me start with this a side. So my a side will basically contain a div. Okay, and inside this div, if I go back to my UI, okay, so basically we have our sidebar and then we have our main component, right? So we have already added our nav bar. So we'll verify that once we complete this part. Okay, so let me go back to my code. So now inside this a div, I want to add this button and a div which will have other history buttons, right? So for that, I have this div. So firstly, I can have a button. Okay. So this button will be basically new chat. And then let me have a div. Okay. So new buttons will come here. Okay. So now we have our a side, and also let me add this section part. So that's pretty simple. So let me start with div. And if you see our section part, we have our conversation, and then we have our text area, and then we have our button, right? So let's go and add that. That will be a div. And then we will have another component called a form. Okay. So inside this div, so let me add another div. And here, let me say conversation goes here. Okay. Also, let me have a button here. So this will be basically acting as the loader. So let me add, please wait. Okay. And with this, I have my div completed. So now inside this form element, let me add a text area and a button. For this, let me just simply copy and paste. Okay. So with this, we have our component ready. So let me run this code. So let me open the terminal. So let me run this. So I can say bun run dev. So, but now we haven't added our index.html here. So it's still getting this hello via bun from our index.tsx. So let's quickly create a server. So I can say const server equal to bun.serve. And let me serve in the localhost. So I can say localhost, and then port will be basically and port number 3000. Okay, and I need to have a fetch handler. I can have fetch, and let me add a fetch handler. Okay, so basically this fetch handler will be a type of function fetch handler. So this will give us a request argument of type request, and then this will have a response type of response. Okay, so let me start by returning the index.html. So I can say return new response, and I can pass the file, and let me pass the index.html. Okay, so with this I have handled my fetch. So this will basically handle all the incoming requests, and here we are getting the request, and it will return a response. Okay, so my server is still running. So let me go to my browser and let me refresh this. Okay, so now we have a cluttered UI. So let's quickly add some CSS into this. So for that, let me go back to my index.html, and let me add a style tag here. So I'll simply copy and paste. So the code will be available in our GitHub, so you can always refer that. And then let me add few of my CSS to the element as well. So my nav should have a class fluid container. So I can say container fluid, and my main also should have a container fluid. So I can say class container fluid. Okay, and inside this aside I can have this sidebar. So I can say class sidebar. Okay, and then this will be chat history. So I can say class equal to chat history. So inside this main container, this should be in grid. So please note that all these CSS are from our pico.css, pico CSS. Please don't be confused with that. So now inside this section, so this will be of our chat box, and this will be of scroll bar, and then this will be of our ID, let's say have messages. So this is where all our conversation will be listed, and also let's have a class of messages. Okay, and then this button will act as a indicator for our HTMX. So let me add it a bit later on. So with this, I think I have added all the required CSS for this ChatGPT clone. So let me go and refresh. Okay, so basically we have our structure for the ChatGPT. So now let's understand what should happen, right? So let's start by creating a chat. So basically I have this text area, and then I have this button, right? So whenever I type anything, and if I send, this should go to my server, right? So first, let's add an endpoint for this form element, and then we can continue further. Okay, so let's start with the form element. So here we are going to use HTMX to handle our AJAX request. Okay, so using HTMX, it's pretty simple. So I can simply say I can use hx-post, and I will post to an endpoint called /new chat. Okay, so basically when I submit, when I click on the send button, this form element will make a post request to this endpoint /new chat, basically localhost 3000 /new chat. So this will be handled by our HTMX. Okay, and then I can add a target. So I can say hx target, and I can say dot messages. So what do I mean by hx target messages? So that means whenever I call this endpoint, and whatever response I get from this endpoint will be added to this dot messages, basically inside this div. The response from this /new chat will be rendered inside this div with the class messages. Okay, so basically when should I add that response to this div? So I can add hx.swap equal to before end. Okay, so what does we mean like hx swap before end? So this means that I will add the response from this endpoint to this div until I get this closing div. That means I will be entering inside this. Okay, and also once we create a new chat, we should basically clear our text area, right? So for that I can use under equal to, and let me simply copy and paste. I can say on submit, the target should be reset. Basically it will convert this to my empty string. Okay, so let's go back to our browser. Let me open my inspect, and let me refresh, or let me open this in the sidebar. Okay, so let's go to our network tag. So let me clear all this and let me refresh. Okay, and then let me send something. So I'll say hello, and if I say send, so it basically tried to make a request to new chat, And when I say localhost 3000 slash new chat, basically it returns the same button which we had, right? Since we didn't handle the response correctly here, for every fetch handler, I'm returning this index.html. So that is the reason I'm getting this new chat. Please wait inside this. Okay. So how should we handle this? Okay. So let's handle that. So let's say const URL equal to new URL, and let me pass the request.url. Okay. So I will return this index.html only if my endpoint is empty string or slash, right? So I can say if url.pathname is equal to an empty string or url.pathname is equal to slash. So in that case, I will return index.html, or in the other case, I will return a string of not found with a status message of 404. Okay, I hope you understand. So if my endpoint is either empty string or slash, so in that case, I will return a response with the index.html. If my endpoint doesn't match with this condition, so in that case, I will return 404. So which means not handled, right? So let me go back to my application. Let me refresh and let me say hello. Let me send. So now I should get 404, which basically means that the endpoint doesn't exist, right? So let's go and add this slash new chat, which should be pretty simple. So let's say if url.pathname is equal to slash new chat, and let's make sure, since we can see that this form is making a post request, so we should make sure it is a post method, and you can say request.method is equal to post. So if it is new chat, I will grab the form data from my request. So if we go back to my application, you can see we have this payload, right? It's a type of form data and we're getting this message, right? So we can grab the message from our form data. So I can say const form data is equal to, so I will get this from my request.form data. But as you can see, this form data returns a promise. I need to convert this function to a async function. And since this is an async function, so I need to return a promise of response. Okay. So basically request.form data, it's empty. So I can write here await, and I can return this as any, because I'll be getting this form data only. Okay. So from this form data, let's grab the message. So I can say const message is equal to form data dot get, and let me get the message. I can confirm this because the key here is message. Okay. So with this, I will get the message. And what will happen if I get the message? Okay. So if we go back to our MongoDB, we have this role user and we have this role assistant. So a message provided by the user from the text area, the role should be user, right? So now let's define the role. So I can say const role equal to, I will say user. Okay. So now let's go back to our UI. And this is a new chat, right? Or we can have the existing chat. So if it is an existing chat, so we should have different functionality. But if it is a new chat, it will have a different functionality. Okay. So let's handle that. So I can check here basically if current chat ID. So what is this current chat ID? Current chat ID basically means that which is the current active chat. So if it is new, then it will be null. And if I'm opening existing chat, at that time I should have some chat ID, right? So currently I don't have any chat ID. So let me define this in top of the file. So let me have it here. So I can have let current chat ID will be of type string or null. So let me assign it to null. Okay. So if the current chat ID exists, then we'll have some condition. So let's have the condition first, which doesn't have the current chat ID, right? So let me say else. So in that case, what we have to do is we need to see if we have any collection in our MongoDB, right? So before that, let's first initialize our MongoDB and let's create a schema first. So it should be, let's say schema.ts, and I will quickly copy and paste this one. Okay. So here you can see that we have to install our new dependency, which is basically Mongoose. So let me copy. Let me open my terminal. So let me go back to my terminal and let me say bun add mongoose. So basically when I run this command bun add mongoose, it will add this Mongoose package in my current project. So you can see I have my MongoDB dependencies here. And let me check package.json. I have my Mongoose here. Okay. So since I have my schema ready now, so basically my chat history schema will contain a summary, which will be of type string, and then a messages, which will be a type of array, which will have a role and a content. Okay. So let me go back to my index.tsx, and here just after initializing my server, I can run my MongoDB collection, right? So here let me say await, and let me say mongoose.connect. And now I need to provide the URI. So from where will I get this URI? So I can get from the environment. I can say process.env. So let me say mongo URI. Let's ensure that this will not be undefined. So let me go and quickly add a .env file. Okay. And here, let me go and paste the key which I just created, mongo URI. And then here I can say mongo URI equal to the string of our MongoDB. Okay. So I'm making this public for now, but after I complete this video, I will revoke this password. Okay. So let me go back to my application. So here what I'm doing is I'm creating a MongoDB connection, right? So I'm connecting to this particular URI, which I'm getting from the env. And then I have this server. So let me print here. Let me add a console here. So I can say console.log. Let me add a template string. I can say Chat GPT Clone using bun is running on, I can say server.hostname, and then I can say server.port. So with this I can see that my server is running. So let me run my application again, and you can see we have our clone using bun is running on the localhost port 3000, and bun automatically runs our .env, so we don't have to use .env like we used to use in our Node.js. So bun will handle by itself. Okay, so let me go back to my Mongoose and let me clear the document. So let me delete this. So I can say chat stories and let me drop. So I want to start fresh because this was from the existing application. Since we are building a Chat GPT clone, so I want to start fresh. So there was a reason I cleared the collection. Okay, so let's continue to our application. So if we don't have the current chat ID, it's a new chat. So let's form a message. So I can say const new chat is equal to, so this will be basically a messages, and I can add a new here. I can say role. I can say role is role, and the content will be basically the message which you get from the form data. Okay, so now we have this new chat. So now it's time to add this chat into our MongoDB collection. So I can say const created chat is equal to await. So since I'm making a MongoDB request, so I can use my schema, chat history schema. Okay, so this is the Mongoose model. I can use this. So let me go back to my index.tsx. So I can say here await chat history dot create, and then I can create a new document. So this will be basically a new chat. Okay, so far what I've done is, like, if we don't have the current chat ID, which is basically null for now, it means that this is a new chat. So in that case, we have these messages, we have added our role and content in this message, and then we created a DB entry out of that new chat. Okay, since we are adding our new conversation, we can say that this is our current chat ID, right? So this will be our current chat ID, and also we need to maintain the history current messages in our application. Okay, so for that, let me create multiple variables here. So just below my current chat IDs, so let me say let current chat messages, and let me create a type. Basically it will be easier for our TypeScript. So I can say type chat message is equal to role of type string, and content, sorry, it should be comma, and then content of type string as well. Okay, and then my current chat messages will be basically of type list of chat messages, and it will be initially empty. Okay, so with this, what I mean is my current chat messages will be empty for initial case. If we don't have our chat ID, so we assume this is our new chat, and then we created MongoDB entry, and after we create the MongoDB entry, we should make sure that this is my current chat ID and this is my current chat messages, right? So let me assign my current chat ID will be basically, I need to convert my created chat ID. So the ID I've converted to the string because this ID is an object ID. Okay, and then I need to add my current chat messages dot push. So let me add a new here. Let me say role, basically the role, and the content will be basically a message. Okay, and then I can return a new button. So when I create a new chat, I should return a new button because I should have the button available here just below this new chat. Okay, so let me return a button. So I can say return new response, and then here I can return a div. Cool. So here let me simply copy and paste, and let me explain one by one what exactly I've done here. So I've copied and let me paste it here. So let me reformat this. Okay, also let me format it correctly. Okay, so after successfully creating a new chat, what I've done is I've returned a div, and then when I return this div, basically where will this div be placed? So if you remember, when we say slash new chat, if you go to our index.html, slash new chat basically means this one. So the response from this slash new chat will be replaced inside these messages. Okay, so that means the div which I'm returning from this endpoint slash new chat, that will be placed inside our messages div. Okay, and what am I returning here when I create a new chat? So here in this div, what I'm doing is I'm making a get request to this endpoint slash get GPT response. So basically what I'm doing here is I will be getting the ChatGPT response. So how it goes is, let me go to the UI. So when I type something here, and if I send, so basically I should wait for the ChatGPT to provide me some response, right? So that's what I'm doing here. When I return this div as a response here, this will go and mount into this div, and once it is mounted, which means that load, when it is loaded, so in that case it will make a API request to this slash get GPT response, and whatever response it will get, it will go and add into our dot messages as previous example. So the response from this slash new chat was added into the div with the class dot messages, and in this case the response from this slash get GPT response will be rendered inside the div with the class dot messages. Okay, and we have this AJAX indicator, which basically means that when we are making such AJAX call, I need to show some indicator, right? Some loading icon and all. For that, I'm having this hash indicator. So if I go back to my index.html, so I have this button, right? So I need to convert this button to a HTMX indicator. So adding that, it's pretty simple. So I can just simply add a class name. So I can say class, and I can have HTMX dash indicator. And since I'm adding the hash ID there, so I can say ID, and let me have this as an indicator. Okay, and let me add one more field. So aria busy, and this will be basically true. So when I say aria busy, so it indicates an element is being modified, and that assistive technologies may want to wait until the modifications are complete before exposing them to the user. So this is the example of what aria busy exactly means. Okay, so now we have our loading button. So this means a HTMX indicator. This will be a loading. So that means whenever I make some AJAX call using our HTMX, so I'll be calling this HTMX indicator, which will show us loading. Okay, so far we have created a new chat, and we assume that since it's a new chat, we assume that it is not the current chat ID, right? Because we're starting fresh. So in that case, we created a new object of new chat with a list of messages, and then we append the role of user and the message which we get from the form data, and then we created a DB entry, and then we get the current chat ID from the created chat, and we assign this variable globally, and also we assign the messages to the current chat messages. So these two fields will be used globally. Okay, so let me go back to my application and let's see what exactly happens in this point. Okay, so let me clear the network call and let me send. So you see, I get the response. So I get this div as a response. And then once this was loaded, tries to make an API call to this slash get GPT response. And since this slash get GPT response doesn't exist, so I got 404. So now it's time to handle this get GPT response. Let's go to our application and let's handle this endpoint. So let me close this for now. And let me say if URL dot path name is equal to slash. So let me copy the endpoint from here. get GPT response, and let me close this, and request dot method is equal to get. So why get? Because if you remember, it's doing a HTMX get. Okay, so let me close this again, and let me handle this. So now we need to make some GPT call, right? So let's get the messages. Also, before that, since we're going to get the GPT response, I need to use ChatGPT, right? So let me go and create new file. So I can say gpt.ts. Okay. So here I need to use a OpenAI library. So I can go and simply add the package. So I can say bun add OpenAI. Okay. So the package is now installed, and then can make a GPT call now. So before we continue, please make sure you have the API key from our ChatGPT. So you can go and create the secret key. I've done already. Okay. So you can go to platform.openai.com and you can create your own API key. And once you have the API key, so make sure to add it in the .env file. Okay. So I'll add it later on so that it is not exposed to any of you or anyone. So let me continue with my gpt.ts. So here I will say import, and I will import my OpenAI from OpenAI. And then here, let me create an instance of this OpenAI. So I can say const OpenAI is equal to new OpenAI, and this will take a API key. Okay. So we can get our API key from our .env. So that will be basically process.env. So if I go to the API key, it says it defaults to process.env open API key. So let me have the same, and let me go to my .env, and here we'll have a open API key, which I will add secretly. Okay. So let's go back to our gpt.ts and let's continue. So let's create a function here. I can say function make GPT call, and this will have the messages, and let me have an any, so we can have the type later on. And let's say const. So let's provide these messages to our ChatGPT, and let's get the response from the messages. Okay. So I can say const completions or completion is equal to await openai.chat.completions.create. Okay. So I can create a new completion. So this will basically take an input of messages, and then it will take an input of our model, which will be basically default to GPT 3.5 Turbo. Okay. Since I'm using this await here, I need to make this function an async function, and then I need to export this function. So I can say export make GPT call. Okay. So what I need to return from here is I need to return the first choices. So here I will get from this completion, I will return the, so let me say return, and I can return the completion dot choices. So I want to return the first choice, and I want to return the content. I can say message dot content. Okay. If I go and check this completion, so this completion will have basically a choices, and the choices will have our message, and chat completion message will have basically content a role, right? If I make this function call, I'll have to provide this message, and then I'm providing this message to the ChatGPT, and then this OpenAI will basically use this message and the model to create a completion. And once we get the completion, so we choose the first choice, and from the first choice we get the message and the content. Okay. So this is it from this GPT part. So let me close this. Also, let me close the other files. Okay. So now, since I have my make GPT call function, I can consume that function here. So here, let me say const, I can say GPT response is equal to await, and let me say make GPT call, and let me pass the current chat messages. So why current chat messages? Because when we create a new chat, we assign the current chat messages here. So we add this role, we add this content, right? So that is the reason why I'm passing. So whatever I assigned in this part, like in this endpoint, that is still valid for this endpoint, right? When I come to this endpoint, so my current chat messages is still whatever I pushed in this endpoint. And now I need to push this response, the response from our chat GPT to my current chat messages. Okay. So I can say current chat messages dot push. So this time my role would be basically assistant, because this is the response from the chat GPT, and then I can add the content, which will be basically the GPT response. Okay. So here the GPT response may be empty. So I'll say or an empty string. Okay, so now it's time to add the message to our database as well, because whenever we have a new message or a conversation, we should add to the database so that we can have the history, right? So let's say await, and let me have the chat history, and let me update one. So what should I update? So basically I will be updating this ID. So what is my current chat ID? So if you remember, we set our current chat ID here, which is basically we converted the object ID to the string. So at this point, my current chat ID will be the same chat ID which we created. The ID of this new chat will be the current chat ID, right? So let me simply copy and paste, because I need to convert the object ID back to, like, the string back to the object ID. And here basically I can use mongoose.mongo object ID and current chat ID, because this current chat ID is a string right now, right? So since this is a string, I'm converting this string to an object ID. Okay, so what should I update to? Basically I should set the new conversation, right? So I can say set, so let me format, and I can set the messages to be current messages. So whatever we have in this current chat messages, we'll be adding that to the messages in our DB. Okay, and now let's create our output. So I can say let formatted HTML is equal to, so it will be initially empty. And one thing I forgot to add here is, so whenever we connect it to this MongoDB, we should make sure that we load all the chats. What I mean is, we should load whatever exists in our MongoDB, so that we know that if that chat already exists or not. So for that, so let me create one variable here, and then I can say let chat IDs, it will be of string array, and it will be initially empty. So why am I maintaining this? Because I want to check if the ID of the chat already exists or not. Okay, so here I can make a DB call. So I can say const DB chats. So I need to fetch this from my database. So I can say await chat history dot find. So I'm getting all the documents from this chat history collection. Okay, so let me loop through this DB chat. So I can say for, I can say const chat of DB chats, and then I will insert the IDs. So I can say chat IDs dot push. So I will push all the ID from this chat, right? So I can convert this to a string, and then let me get the chat ID. Okay, so this way I can make sure that all my chats are unique, right? So let me go back here. So now I need to check if that particular current chat ID exists in our chat IDs or not. So let me check that. If chat IDs dot includes current chat ID, so let's make sure this exists. So if the current chat ID is present in the chat IDs, in the list of these chat IDs, then in that case we need to update our formatted HTML. Will be basically a div. Let me simply copy and paste. So here we'll basically add our GPT response. So we'll simply add our GPT response, right? So if it doesn't exist, else, so let me add the formatted HTML again, and this will be GPT response. Okay, in case our current chat ID doesn't present in the list of these chat IDs, then in that case what we are doing is we are making sure that we have this new div. So let me format it again so that it is a bit easier to read. So let me move this to the new line. Okay, so here if the current chat ID is present in this chat IDs, we are simply returning the GPT response. Else, if the current chat ID is not present in this current chat IDs, then in that case we need to load the history of that particular chat. Okay, so in any of the case, so let me return the response. I can say return new response, and let me return the formatted HTML with a status of 200. Okay, so let's make sure we run our app. So I will say run dev, and let me go to my UI and let me refresh, and you see we have this get GPT response, and we don't have any endpoint where we have this get GPT response, right? So let me clean this. Let me create a new chat. I'll say hello test. So when I send, so let me make sure my DB is still empty. So it's empty. So let me send. So we have this hello test, and we're making a GPT call. And now, hello, how can I assist you? So this is a response from my chat GPT. And when we have this response from this chat GPT, it returns this div because that current chat ID doesn't exist in our chat IDs. So which means that we need to create a new entry, and that in that case now we are loading our history button, right? So when we return this div, what it means that please make a get request when this div is loaded, and the response should be added to our chat history. So what is this chat history? Let's go back to our index.html. Do we have a chat history here? Yes, we have. The response should be added to this chat history, right? So which means that whenever we call this, the response from this div should be added into this particular here. So that means we should have a button here. Okay. So now let's create this endpoint, because we don't have this endpoint. Let's create and let's handle this endpoint. Okay, let's go to our index.tsx and let's say if, so we're very expert now, we can say if url.pathname is equal to, and we are expert in copy pasting. So let me copy and paste /load history. And so since you can see this is a get request, so I can say and request dot method is equal to get. So in that case, what should we do? So in that case, let's get the messages. So we can say let messages equal to current chat messages, and we'll say messages dot push. So let's push a message. So we can have a role, will be basically a user, and then we'll have a content. So we'll ask ChatGPT to make a summary out of these current chat messages, because if we check the UI, we don't have the button, history button, right? So we want to maintain this history button with a text. So let me simply copy and paste the content. So what I mean here is summarize this conversation in maximum of 3-word sentence, generally describing what the conversation is about. So basically, using these current chat messages, I want ChatGPT to suggest me a suggestion based on the messages. Okay, so now I have the messages. So now let's try to get this summary. So I can say const summary is equal to, let's make a ChatGPT call, make GPT call, and let me pass the messages. So now whatever message I have here, so this will be passed to my ChatGPT, and based on this content, we're asking ChatGPT to create a summary. So now we'll get the summary. So whatever summary we get here, we will add this to our chat history collection, DB collection. Okay, so we can say await chat history dot update one. Let me update the current chat ID. So I can say underscore ID, and let me simply copy and paste the previous one. So I want to update this particular current chat ID, and I want to set. So let me format before that, and then I want to set summary here. Okay, so the summary should be basically equal to the summary. Cool, right? So now once I set this summary, I should return the button, right? And before that, I can make sure that now I have this current chat ID in my chat IDs. So I can say chat IDs.push current chat ID. Let's make sure this is not null. So when I add this exclamation, it basically means that this should not be null. So I assume this will not be a null. And now let me return a button. So basically, let me just copy and paste, and let me explain you everything here. Yeah. So basically here, after I load the history button, so what I mean by /load history button is, what I mean is I want the history button here so that I should be able to click, right? So what happens here is when I say /load history button, I get the current chat messages, and then I create a new entry here with a role user and a content to summarize the messages so that I can create summary. And then based on the messages, I asked ChatGPT to create a summary for me. And once I get the summary, I updated the summary to my chat history collection for that particular ID. And then I make sure I add the current chat ID into the chat IDs, so that the next time when I check the chat IDs, it should exist, right? And then in the response, I return a button. Basically, what I want in my UI is a button here, and I return a button, so which will basically make a get request, and then this will be triggered when I click on the button, and whatever response I get from this button should be added to the div with the class messages, basically inside this div. Okay, and then what I mean by hx swap is the response whatever I get from here, so everything, all the response will be swapped inside these messages, right? So all the HTML inside this div will be replaced by the response from this /load chat. Okay, and also I make sure the data chat ID is basically the current chat ID, because when I click on the history button, I should know which button did I click, right? So to identify the button, I've added this data chat ID here, and then when I make an HTMX request, so at that time I make sure that I pass the chat ID as a URL parameter so that I can grab the chat ID. So where am I getting this chat ID from? when I say this dot get attribute and I pass the key, so this is the key basically I've added to this one. So I get this attribute, and that attribute is being added as a query parameter when I call this /load chat. Okay, so let me save, let me format, and let me refresh my UI. Okay, so basically still now we don't have anything here, but we should have our entry here. So let me refresh. We should have some collection here, and we have couple of chat histories, right? So we have couple of entries here. So let's make sure we load the entries in our UI. So for that, I need to go to index.html. So let me go to index.html, and then I need to go to my body, and let me quickly copy and paste the HTMX commands. So basically what I mean here in the body is I want to call this endpoint /load history on page load whenever this body is mounted in my UI. And whatever response I get from this /load history on page load, I want to append it to this .chat history div. So if I see my chat history div, basically this is the chat history. Okay. So what I mean from here is I want to get all the buttons, history buttons here when I refresh or when I call this endpoint. First time when I load this HTML. Okay. So whatever response I get from this endpoint will be added to this chat history, and this swap will be done only after the begin tag. Okay, so I've saved. Let me go and refresh, but now this endpoint doesn't really exist, right? So let's go and create this endpoint. So let's go to our application. Let's go to our index.tsx, and let me handle that particular request. So it should be outside this. So I can say if url.pathname is equal to, and let me handle that. Let me go to my index.html. Let me copy this /load history on page load, and request.method is equal to get. Let's confirm it's a get. Yes, it's a get request. So in that case, what I need to do is let's create a list of buttons. I can say let buttons is equal to, for now, let's say an empty list, and let's fetch all the chats. So I can say const chats equal to await chat history dot find. So basically I'm getting all the chats, all the conversation, all the chat from my chat history collection, and then now I will loop through these chats. I can say for, and then let me say const chat of chats. So let me copy the button HTML. So basically here I've created a button, and also let me get this chat ID. So I can say const chat ID will be basically I need to convert to a string. So I can say string, and I need to convert the chat dot underscore ID. Okay. So here I've created a button which basically says class is a summary, and then this will make a get request /load chat. So this will be triggered only when I click on this particular button. And then here also I have added this data chat ID, which is basically the current chat ID, and whatever response I'm getting from this button will be added to this .messages div, and it will replace the entire inner HTML. And when we make the AJAX call, so we are getting the chat ID and adding it to the query parameter, and then we are setting the title to the summary. Okay, so now it's time to add all this button HTML to my buttons. So I can say buttons dot push. So let me add our button HTML. Okay, and here I can return all the buttons. So I can say return new response, and I can return all the buttons. So I can say buttons dot join. I need to return as a string. So I can say return join. So let me combine by the space. Okay, the status of 200. Okay, so let's go back and let's refresh. So you see, we have our buttons, but since our summary is undefined, because at that moment we didn't have any summary, we handled our GPT call only after having all those inputs. So this is undefined. We'll fix it later on. We'll basically clear this from our MongoDB. But when you see like we have this load history on page load, it's not being called. I think it was the previous request. So let me refresh again. Okay, it's working. So we're getting the response. Okay. So these are the buttons which you are getting, and it is being rendered here. Cool. So let's handle when we click on this undefined. We don't have this load chat. Right now we need this endpoint. How did we get this endpoint? Because if you remember, we have this load chat endpoint here, right? And then we're adding this chat ID as a query parameter. So let's handle that endpoint. So let's say if url.pathname is equal to, let me copy this, slash load chat, and request dot method is equal to get. Okay, so now it's time to get our query parameter, right? Because when I call this slash load chat endpoint, I'm passing this chat ID as a query parameter, right? So how can I get that query parameter? So I can say const chat ID is equal to url dot search params dot get. So I'm getting in this name chat ID, so I can say slash chat ID. Okay, and now using this chat ID, let's find the collection from our MongoDB. So I can say const chat equal to await chat history dot find one, and I can find by the ID. And basically, let me copy and paste the same thing which we did earlier. Okay, so we converted this string to an object ID. Okay, and then I can set my current chat ID to be the chat ID, which is, oh, it should not be current chat ID, it should be chat ID here. Okay, so using this chat ID, we are finding our chat, and then we are assigning this chat ID which we get from the search params to the current chat ID. Okay, and now let's check if our chat exists. If the chat exists, and if the messages in this chat exist, and if the messages is more than one, so in that case I will render the messages. Okay, so let's say const formatted HTML is equal to, so let's loop through this chat messages. So I can say chat dot messages dot map message. So let me return the div. Let me just simply copy and paste. Okay, so I need to return the content. So basically the content is the message, right? So I can say message dot content, and then I can join by the empty string, and then I can return the formatted HTML. So I can say return new response. Now I can return the formatted HTML with a status of 200. Else, if we don't have any message, then we can return new response. So let me just completely copy this, which says that no chat found with the provided ID, and the status should be 200 because we don't found a chat, which means that there is no chat. It's not a fail. So I can say 200. Okay, so let's go back. Let's refresh. So let me clear this and let me refresh. We have everything, right? So when I click on undefined, we get the message. Also, let me click on this undefined. We get this hello test. Hello, how can I assist you today? Okay. So when I click on undefined, so this is the message of this undefined. And when I click on new chat, this should be cleared, right? So let's handle this as well. So let's go back to our index.html and let's go to our new chat button. So let's add our HTMX request here. I can say hx.get. So this will basically get our, so it will clear our chat, and then whatever response I get from this, it should replace our messages. Okay, and it should swap everything outside our that hx swap. So I can say outer HTML. So now when I click on this new chat button, it should basically clear this data, right? So if I click on this, let me refresh and let me say new chat. Basically this doesn't exist, right? So let's go and handle this. So let me go to my index.tsx. Let me handle the new endpoint again. So I can say if url.pathname is equal to slash, let me copy this, clear chat, and request dot method equal to, so if I remember, it should be get. So let's say get. Now let's handle our clear chat. So when we have this clear chat, we basically I want to clear this current chat ID, and I want to clear my current chat messages, right? So let's do this here. I can say current chat ID is equal to null, and current chat messages is equal to an empty list. And let's return a new response. We can say return new response, and this time let's return an empty div. So whatever I return here, class message, so this will be replaced in this particular messages. Okay, so also let me add this ID here. Okay, so let me refresh this and let me click on this undefined. So it loads the chat of this particular undefined. And if I click on new chat, okay, so it is clear now, right? So that means we have our ChatGPT functional. Also, I think we missed one thing here. If we go back, we still need to handle if we have our current chat ID. So what it means is that when I click on this undefined, so if I write something here and if I send, so in that case, I don't have any, like the new chat is not handled, right? In that case. So it means that here I don't handle anything in this one. So that means if I am updating or if I'm having the chat in the existing history, that means I need to update this history, right? I need to update this chat. So that should be pretty simple. So let's go and handle this here. So if we have this current chat ID, using this current chat ID, let's get all the current chat. So I can say const current chat is equal to await chat history dot find one, and I can find by using the ID. I can say underscore ID, and let's use the existing this one. So let me copy this. It's a typo here. So I'm finding the current chat by using this current chat ID. Okay, and I need to check if my current chat is not empty. So I can say if current chat, so if it is not empty or null, so in that case, let's go. So when I say find one, that basically if I don't have any response, so it may be undefined. If we have the current chat, I need to set my current chat messages to this particular current chat, right? So I can say current chat messages is equal to current chat dot messages, or so if I have messages, then I'll set these messages to this particular current chat messages. Otherwise, I'll set to an empty list. Okay, and then I can push current chat messages dot push. So since I'm updating to this particular, so I can have the role of basically user, and I can have the content of basically a message, and then I can update my database. So I can say await chat history dot update one, and I can update based on the ID. So let me copy this line, let me edit here. Okay, and then I want to set to the current message. So let me reformat, and I can say $set, and I can set my messages to be current chat messages. Okay, and after this I can return, like let me return new response, and let me simply copy and paste, or it should be written. Okay, so if the current chat ID exists, so in that case I'm returning this div, which will basically trigger this endpoint slash GPT response. Whenever this div is loaded, whatever response it's getting from this get GPT response, it will go and add in this div with the class dot messages, and until that time it will show this hash indicator as loading, and it will add before the end tag. Okay, so let me format this as well to make it more readable. So don't worry, all this code will be available in GitHub. So if you are not getting along, you can always go back to the code base and check it out. Okay, so let me go back to my browser and let me refresh, and let me clean this undefined, right? Because I really don't understand what is this undefined. So let me clear all this, and let me go to my DB and let me clean this. So I have dropped my chat history, and let me refresh my browser and let me refresh. So now I have a brand new ChatGPT. So let's start by saying, where is Taj Mahal? And if I send this, so I get the response from my ChatGPT. It says that the Taj Mahal is located in Agra, Uttar Pradesh, India, right? So if I go to new chat, it will clean all that. And now if I search a new one, who is Pratap Sharma? And if I say this, I don't know if it'll know. So there are multiple individuals named Pratap Sharma, so it is unclear which specific individual you are referring to. Can you please provide more context or information about the person in question? Okay, let me add some more question. So I can say Pratap Sharma, a senior developer from Nepal. And if I send, so it doesn't know me, but I know myself. I'm a senior developer from Nepal. So now if I go to Taj Mahal, so let me add some more here. Where is Uttar Pradesh? Let me send. Uttar Pradesh is a state in the northern India. It is situated in the northern capital central part of the country. And if I go to identity of the person, let me add some more question. Is he brilliant? Let me send. Let me wait for the response of the ChatGPT, and we get the response, right? And let me refresh. So you see, we still have this chat history here. So let me close this bar. And now if I click on identity of the person, I will have all the history of this conversation. And if I go to Taj Mahal location, I will have all the history of this particular conversation. And also if I go to this new chat, I will basically start a complete new chat. And if I go back to my MongoDB, if I refresh, I have this chat history collection, and here I have multiple entries. One, Taj Mahal location, which is a summary. The other is identity of a person. So inside this, we have multiple messages. One is by the user, which was asked by myself, and the other is the response from the ChatGPT. So this is how it goes. So I hope you were able to follow along with me. And let me just give a brief of what we have written here. So in our index.html, we had this sidebar where we'll be loading all the history buttons, and we have our container section where we'll be loading all our conversations. So there we have this list of conversation, and we have our form element with a text area and a button. So whenever we type anything in this text area and send, it call this /new chat endpoint with a post request, and whatever response it gets from this /new chat, it will go and append the response to this div with the class .messages. So which is basically this one. And whenever we submit successfully, so in that case, it will clear the input. Okay. And if we go back to our index.tsx, we had multiple endpoints with basically /new chat for handling new chat. If the new chat is of the existing chat ID, and then in that case, we are updating that particular chat. Otherwise, if it's a new chat, then we are creating a new entry in our MongoDB, and we are returning the div with the endpoint get GPT response. So in this, we have get GPT response, which basically makes a call to our chat GPT. It passes the messages, and based on the messages, it get the response. And whatever response we get from the chat GPT, we add that response to our current chat messages, and also we append into our database. And based on that, so if that particular current chat ID already exists in our chat IDs, which is existing, so in that case, we simply return our div with the response. Else, we return our formatted HTML, which will basically load our history buttons. So when I say history buttons, so those are the buttons in this particular sidebar. Okay. And when we have this /load history button, we get all the current messages, and we ask the GPT to create a summary out of that message. So it basically means that when I don't have anything here, so if I say hello Pratap, so this in this time I create a new entry, and now the ChatGPT gives me some response, and once that response is back, I create this button, and I ask GPT to basically give me the summary of this conversation. Okay, so this is where we create a summary, and once we get the summary, we make sure we add it into our database, and also we added that particular chat ID to our chat IDs so that we can identify later on. Before we return that button, we basically add that chat ID, current chat ID, to the data chat ID, and we ask that button to call this load chat, and this will be triggered only when we click, and whatever response I get from this /load chat, it will be added to our div with the class .messages. Okay, whenever we make this ajax call, it will grab the data chat ID and add it as a query parameter while calling this load chat. And we had this another endpoint, load history on page load. So this is basically when we initially refresh our browser, so it go and fetch these history buttons. So this endpoint basically go and find all our chat from our database, and then based on each of the chats, it goes and create a button with a hx get of endpoint load chat, and it will have the chat ID as a data chat ID, and it will add that chat ID as a query parameter while making a get request to this load chat. Okay, and we have this endpoint /load chat, which will basically load the chat based on the chat ID, and then whatever chat it gets. So if we go back to our /load chat, the response from this endpoint will be added to this particular div with the class .messages. Okay. And if the chat exists and the chat messages exist, so in that case, we create a formatted HTML of all the list of divs. Otherwise, we say no chat found with the provided ID. And also, we created a new endpoint called clear chat, which will basically be triggered when we click on this particular new chat button. This will basically remove our current chat ID and all the current chat messages to the empty list so that we can create a new conversation out of it. So basically, this is the summary of our application. So I will add this code base to GitHub so that you can always go back and look what we exactly build. So the environment variable which we need for this is the MongoDB URL, which we basically consume here. Inside this Mongo URI, and also we have this OpenAI API key, so you can get this pretty easily. So if you go to your database, and if you go to connect, and if you go to the driver, you can always copy this Mongo string and always remember your password. Okay, and for the API key of OpenAI, you can go and create a new secret key and use as per your need. So after a long message, so we have finally created a ChatGPT clone using Bun, HTMX and Pico. I hope you are able to follow along with me and hope to see you in another video. Thank you.